Hi, everybody. If I can have your attention, please, we're going to get started. I don't want to keep you here too long. We have an hour and we have a lot of great conversation to be had. So we're going to jump right in. For those of you who I did not have an opportunity to meet in person today, my name is Wendy Skolnick. I'm Associate Vice President Philanthropy for Eastern and Western Canada. I'm based out of the Montreal office, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here for Mission Imperative. This week, the Mission Imperative Tour began in Montreal. Then on Tuesday, we went to Toronto. Today we're here, and tomorrow we'll be finishing up in Calgary, each city addressing a different focus. Based on having spoken with a few of you this morning, I know that today's conversation is going to be highly interesting for many of you. In just the last 200 years, the human population has grown exponentially from over 1 billion to more than 8 billion today, resulting in a climate crisis that can seem daunting. Today, we will discuss how science, industry, and each of us can all be part of the solution. For those of you unfamiliar with Weizmann, which I know we do have a few new people here today, so thank you for joining us, the Institute has an over 70-year history at the forefront of scientific discovery. Since 1964, Weizmann Canada has been helping to support these critical discoveries. Part of Weizmann's reputation is built by challenging current thinking with curiosity-driven research, which has led to life-changing breakthroughs. The Weizmann Institute of Science began its sustainability efforts back in the 1980s, led by visionary donors from Canada with the launch of solar research on campus. The vital work in sustainability continues today through efforts to make our campus more sustainable and with the launch of the Institute for Environmental Sustainability, a commitment to take immediate action on turning the tide on climate change and making the next 10 years count. Recently, Weizmann ranked 8th in the world for research quality in the prestigious Leiden University ranking among the likes of Harvard, MIT, and Princeton, and the only institute outside the US to rank in the top 8. One thing the current pandemic has taught us is that science is the key to a better tomorrow for all of humanity. Weizmann research transcends borders and reaches us in Canada every day. Last year alone, Weizmann co-published studies with more than 30 Canadian institutions on topics ranging from the environment to therapeutic discoveries. Encouraging dialogue and collaboration to promote new discoveries is what Weizmann is all about, which is why we're so very pleased to welcome you here today. Before we begin, I would like to sincerely thank our event sponsors, who without their vital support today would not be possible. Wealth Standards, Nutrien, Jaroslawski Fraser, Raymond James and Rempart Asset Management, the Stephen Schiller family, RBC Foundation on behalf of Marita Symbolizon Wealth Management Group, and Andrea Yampolsky of AY Talent. In a moment, Steve Hansen, Managing Director and Equity Analyst at Raymond James, will join us to begin the conversation. Rather than read Steve's bio to you, which would take a long time, we simply asked him to provide his top 3 achievements as they relate to the topic today. Here's what he said. An award-winning equity analyst covering the agriculture and chemical sector, acting as a trusted advisor to some of the largest institutional money managers in the country, while also providing regular contributions to respected Canadian media outlets such as BNN, the Financial Post, and the Globe and Mail. Author of several reports chronicling how technology is driving sweeping change across the world's traditional ag and food industries, affecting not only how we grow and where we grow, but also how we quantify agriculture's environmental footprint. And finally, proud father of 3 teenagers, aged 18, 14, and 13. And for any of us who have children, know that is the biggest accomplishment. Okay, well, let's get started. So to begin, please direct your attention to the screen for this short video introduction.
I love this place. Believe it or not, only 120,000 years ago, the Dead Sea level was even lower than what it is today. We study what happened back then to predict what will happen due to global warming.
Today's state-of-the-art solar technology only works well in specific locations, like here, in the desert. Our future lies in designing intelligent materials that capture sunlight anytime, anywhere.
Clouds are one of the most important components of the climate system. They control the amount of energy that reaches the surface. So the question is, how will climate change affect them?
Our lab is studying microbes in their natural habitats to see how we can work with them to alleviate human impact on the environment.
By understanding when and where plants flower, we can greatly improve present-day crops and also introduce new ones that would better cope with a rapidly changing environment.
Did you know that it takes about 2,700 liters of water to dye one single cotton t-shirt? We are developing cotton in different colors, which would save a huge amounts of water and would create green new sustainable materials, or red, or blue, or yellow.
Israel is a country with abundant sunshine. We are researching intelligent materials that are not only better at harnessing this energy, but can even self-heal.
Plants and forests absorb huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. In our research, we're asking, how can we enhance their ability to slow down global warming?
Every second breath we take is created by algal blooms in the ocean. It's therefore vital to understand how this ecosystem functions.
Corn, rice, soybean, and this wheat are the 4 major crops that feed humanity. Improving their yield and nutritional value in a sustainable manner will benefit all of us.
Understanding how microorganisms influence our oceans now and in the past will give us insight into what will happen under climate change. This is critical information for ocean stewardship.
So, thank you everyone. Get this working here. Real pleasure. Thank you for taking some time out of your day today. Critical issues that we're talking about here, broadly speaking. But, as we think about, food security, the environment, some of these issues, I would argue food security in particular, 5 years ago was, a page 5, a page story in the press. But if you look at it, the press today, pretty much any major publication you look at, it's really migrated onto page 1 or page 2. And it's not entirely surprising, but if you look at a lot of the key, underlying drivers behind this, climate change, extreme crop stress, drought, not just domestically, but internationally. We've got Sri Lanka food riots lately. We've got food rationing effectively in countries like Iran. And even here domestically, we've got effectively a 50-year drought that's impacting the whole Western continent. And that's impacting everything from fresh produce delivery and production right through to the animal side and protein side. So it's a very real issue and very near and dear to what I spend a lot of time on. And it's ultimately, I think an issue that science and technology is going to play a critical role in helping solve, not just the next 10 years, but probably the next 50 years as we look to add another few billion people to the planet. So it's sort of that under sort of backdrop, or that sort of like framing of the reference here. I think we've got a number of good things to talk about today. A few housekeeping items for you just quickly. The event is being recorded today, will be made available afterwards. Unfortunately, Dave Dienson was originally on the schedule, but not able to join us today. But we promise you we'll still have a fantastic discussion. Both Professor Levy and I will explain some of the things we do to get started, just at the highest level, 5 minutes each. Tell you some of the things we're excited about. And then we'll get into more of a moderated discussion. There will be a Q&A afterwards, but I think we're a small enough audience here, or I think we can probably just, if you've got a question throughout the course of it, I would just suggest you raise your hand. We can get right into it. There's no need to wait till the end. I think better to ask the question while we're on the topic of the moment, if that makes sense for you guys. So with that, I think we're gonna get right into it. So just let me set the stage for a few minutes. I think I was describing to someone earlier that I'm an equity research analyst, and I'm not too sure many of you actually know what that is. So just for a quick moment, describing what I do. So I work for an investment bank, but my day job is really studying the agricultural industry, the companies within it, and all the key fundamentals that help drive that sort of broader sector. And then that includes everything from the highest level, big global bellwether firms like a Nutrien in the fertilizer sector, right down to small cap related companies that would be $50 million in size, sort of trying to advance new technologies into the sector. But what it does do is it provides me with sort of a really unique purview or intersection of sort of a bunch of different things. Again, the large global macro drivers, some of the capital inflows that are coming in, and then some of the new technologies that are trying to permeate. My job really ultimately is to try and make recommendations on companies that have a good prospect of succeeding and making shareholders money. So buy, sell, or hold, simplistically. It's a fun job most days, but more recently it's been a little more challenging. But it's cool because we do get to see a lot of the newest, youngest companies coming up that are really influencing a lot of the issues that we'll discuss today. There are a few and smaller ones in Canada you might be familiar with. As just an example, Cubic Farms is sort of in the vertical growing space. A company like Devron is very focused on soil science and soil technology, soil biome, and even a company like Farmer's Edge, which is just very sort of like operating system based, trying to generate the next Microsoft for the farm effectively, or Windows for the farm, I made a better analogy. But the point is that we get a good cross-section that allows us to sort of value a lot of these things, and I think hope have a good discussion with the professor here today. A couple things that I wanted to just sort of describe to you that we're excited about, we've been seeing. So, capital availability into the space for the last 5 to 6 years has been really flush. So there's been a pile of money pouring into the sector. It really has permeated all aspects of the supply chain. So if you think about agriculture, it's everything from the upstream, right at the farm level, where they're thinking about applications, nutrients, all the different inputs into the field. There's new technologies being developed, right through down the value chain from grain storage. We're having a discussion about that here today. Creating smart storage bins as opposed to like effectively dumb storage bins that don't really provide any data. And then all the way down the value chain from logistics. And just thinking about tracking the grain at you think about carbon tracking and carbon credits, the ability to track a kernel of grain from the field through the processing facility into the food item down to the consumer. There's a lot of technology that's being used to adapt and to sort of effectively allow that to take place today, which is exciting. Just to give you a rough sense for some capital flows, in 2013 there was about $2 billion a year going into ag and ag tech. Last year that was north of 30. So there has been a significant ramp up in capital investment. I actually suspect we'll see a slight reduction this year because capital availability is just being more challenged. But the point is there's a lot of interesting new companies that have come up given the capital availability. 2 or 3 areas that we're really excited about that we've seen a lot of development. One is controlled environmental agriculture. We call it sort of CEA. Simplistically, it's indoor growing. As you're all familiar, greenhouses have been around for 30 years. That's not a novel concept, but the ability to take growing truly indoors and rely upon some really advanced, I'd say leap changes in LED lights, the ability for precision control, effectively providing the perfect growing environment for a plant indoors, typically in a large indoor facility that would be quite close to an urban population center. And that's allowing for really high value crops, lettuce, basils, microgreens, and these types of things that have high rotation to be grown close to source and be shipped effectively a few miles to the consumer. If you compare that today to where the bulk of our produce comes from the California Central Valley that's heavily stressed on water availability. So you're shipping it 2,000 to 3,000 miles depending where your final destination is. And by the time it gets there, it's kind of already deteriorating. Now you can grow it close to source, high value, no pesticides, no application inputs, and use 95% less water. So it's just one of those examples of an advancement in technology. Again, it's LED lights and some of the precision technology on environmental controls that have allowed that to happen. But we're continuing to see leap changes in sort of that technology over time. It's still challenged profitability-wise. We're just kind of breaking even now, but 5 years ago, everyone was losing money. And so I think we'll continue to see that evolution play forth. One other one that we're excited about is alternative proteins, and we've had some discussions about this already today. Canada has a very strong initial competitive advantage in proteins, plant-based proteins. If you're not familiar, we are one of the largest producers and exporters of global pulses. So lentils, chickpeas, faba beans, related products like that have very high protein content that are used effectively fractionated into their constituent components, concentrated and then used for downstream applications. The obvious example would be, your Beyond Meats and your new, everyone thinks about the burger these days, but it goes into a surprisingly endless amount of applications. I have a dog at home that I cherish like my fourth child, and she gets, the $80 bag of food that's all got pea protein out of Canada in it. So it's, it's making its way into all different applications, and that is the very surface level of what's happening. We're seeing all kinds of innovation in and around sort of these alternative protein applications, from the processing side, the drying, the ability to extract higher concentrations, and even the varieties of plants that were originally growing in terms of their attributes. And I'm sure Professor Levy could talk about that as well. So those are just two areas. I would also just note robotics and automation is becoming a big focus in the market. Manual labor is becoming extremely challenged in all markets. So the ability to take some traditional tasks that were manual and automate those is becoming really prominent. There's a group in town here called Semios that has effectively automated all trap monitoring in orchards. You used to have to literally drive down every aisle every day and check the sticky trap to see if the moth outbreak had happened. And if that happened, you had to bomb the crop with a pesticide to get rid of it. Now it's all automated. And the minute they know that there's any sort of infestation, they can blow pheromones automatically and prevent any mating. So it's just another way of precision application that's allowed things to become more efficient with time. So quite excited is the short of it all. I'm just barely scratching the surface, to be honest. There's a whole bunch of different ways. But the technology aspect of ag and farming is really quite exciting here, so we're good. With that, just sort of like teaser, if you will, I'd now like to introduce Professor Avi Levy. He is the Dean of Faculty of Biochemistry, Department of Plant and Environmental Sciences. He is the co-leader of the Institute of Environmental Sustainability at the Weizmann Institute of Science. As done earlier for me, rather than read his full bio, I will give you his 3 accomplishments he's proud of. First, he always feels his next accomplishment will be the most important. I like that. Second, as a professor, he's very proud of his students who have become leaders in academia and industry. I like that, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that because I think that's an interesting part of the Institute. And third, he's proud of his accomplishments in dissecting the molecular mechanisms that contribute to the evolution and plasticity of the plant genome. That's a complicated mouthful, but we can get into what that means as well.
Which is what I'm really doing.
So maybe, Professor, if you could maybe just give us 5 or 6 minutes around your sort of focus of research and what you're up to and what gets you excited about your work at the Institute.
Sure. So good afternoon or morning, whatever, to everybody. I'm Avi Levy. I'm a scientist at the Weizmann Institute. I was born in France. I immigrated to Israel when I was 17, and since then, I studied agriculture. I think from early childhood, I was fascinated by the living world. But you see, that's part of the biodiversity. All the shapes which have been formed, how they were formed, how they evolved, how they come to occur, how new species evolve. And from learning that, I started to see the potential for developing new technology inspired by what evolution does to change the genome of plants and improve them. And for that, and then what to do with it. So there are 2 crops which I'm passionate about. One is wheat and the other is tomato, and I'll tell you a bit more about these 2. So you heard a fascinating introduction on the promises of agriculture, on the future, on the trends. And as I told you, I'm interested by the evolution, where they come from, and where they can go. So looking at the past to learn on the future. And all the crops you heard about, which Canada is so famous for, none of them is from Canada, right? Everything was imported. And where was it imported from? From the Fertile Crescent. So we live really at the source of where plants were domesticated. Wheat was domesticated in the southern Levant, so it's somewhere between Israel and Syria. We know this both from archaeological record and from the genetics, looking at DNA, looking at ancient DNA, and we can learn where all this happened. And from there it started to spread all over the world. Also chickpea and lentils were domesticated somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates at the southeast of the of Turkey or northern Iraq, something in the Levant. So these plants moved from the old world to the new world. And how did they do that? I mean, what happened? It's all, I mean, you heard a lot on the technology, the robotics, and all the fertilizers and so on, which are being used. But I think the great advances in humanity are achieved, especially in agriculture, by a combination of changes in technology and in genetics. Because you need the technology, I mean, agriculture started with the ability to grow plants, to plant them, tools were developed, but at the same time, there were major mutations. I'll give you an example. Wheat has a spike that you can harvest. In nature, this is terrible because you want to spread your seeds. You want to propagate them. So in nature, they disseminate the seeds. And the first mutation that we see in the beginning of agriculture was the loss of fragility of the spike. And that's how archaeologists can recognize that agriculture started by these mutations which affected the crop. So what you see today is a nice wheat spike, nothing natural about it, right? So we can discuss maybe what's natural, what's not natural, and that's also fascinating. So looking at the history of the crop is something which has interested me, and looking at the genome of plant. We live in an era where we have the sequence now of all genome. Now wheat is a fascinating genome. It is much more complex than the human genome. So it has 3 times more genes. Now people sometimes feel strange, that humans are such simple creatures. With all my colleagues in biology, we'll have all these disputes, but if you think about it, it makes sense because we're kind of parasite. We live on plants, or even if we eat meat, the animal ate the plant. So plants are the major source which capture energy from the sun and the mineral from the soil, and they create the organic world that we live on. Also, they create the atmosphere that we breathe, like plants and algae. So all these things, in fact, all these things affect very much our environment that we lived in. So if you look at the genome of wheat, it's extremely complex. It has actually 3 genomes, and part of it is what people call the junk DNA. 90% of it is called junk DNA. It's not genes, it's something else. And for a long time, I've been intrigued by what this does, and part of it is really looks like junk, but part of it plays an important role in the regulation of genes around the genome. So all the jumping genes, transposon, and so on. So that's what interested me. So these were topics which are very esoteric. And while studying them, I got interested to understand what happened when these genes move and make mutations, and this is how I got interested into all the process of mutation and repair of the genome. So this is the plasticity of the plant genome. Now, why plant genome are so plastic? Because they have many genes. Sometimes they have more than one genome. It's called what's called polyploidy. Wheat has 3 different genomes. We have 2, one from dad, one from mom. Wheat has 3 pairs, so 6 genomes. Wow. Okay, so you can mutate one gene, it won't kill the plant, so that gives them plasticity. So it's a phenomenon called polyploidy that also we've been investigating. So plant can evolve rapidly, and thanks to evolution, they reach Canada, and you get all these crops that you mentioned. So through mutation, for example, wheat in its origin, site of origin, looks at that the spring is coming when the day gets longer. In Canada, when you plant the wheat in Saskatoon in May, when the soil is thawing, so the days are already very long, and they grow with a huge day length. So there was need for mutation in the ability of the plants to sense the environment and the length of the day. There was a need for resistance to cold. There was a need for many, many changes which breeders and geneticists have selected mutation after mutation to create these new varieties as we know them. So the Green Revolution, for example, was the ability to grow plants with fertilizer and boost the yield and harvest it mechanically, not anymore with the how do you call it?
Sickle?
Sickle, not anymore with the sickle. So, so always we have this combination of the two. Now, one thing that we are doing, we're studying wheat in nature, the wild wheats, and these wild wheats have contributed already a lot to humanity. in the beginning of the century, previous century, in the US, there was a big leaf rust infection. And there was a little guy, it's in one of the book of who was responsible in the USDA for the introduction of new plants. He described this little guy coming from Palestine who barely speaks English and convinced the USDA to use the wild wheat because he will find resistance to this leaf rust. And that's what they did, and indeed it affected. So all this came from this wild wheat. We took from wild wheat, we mapped genes which affect the nutritious value of the wheat, and which raise the protein content. So instead of having more starch, you get more protein, it's more nutritious. And this gene that we mapped has been transferred to many varieties, especially in Canada, which has high quality wheat, the Manitoba wheat and the wheat which is grown as high protein content compared to wheat in the rest of the world. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And part of these genes come from this wild wheat from Israel.
That's fascinating.
So there is lots of, that's when we say that we need to protect the biodiversity, is because it contains lots of valuable traits. So we need to protect this diversity in the wild, and we need to learn it, and then we can use it eventually. And when you want to transfer the gene also, you know, the modern wheat has high yield and many traits. You don't want to go back to the wild because it's like a regression. You get the low yield and you get undesired traits. So you want really to transfer only the gene that you want, if it's resistant to disease or high protein or high pigment, whatever. So we are developing new technologies that enable now the transfer of, very precise transfer of genes using genome editing technologies, very precise transfer of genes from wild relatives of wheat to modern wheat. So this is one of the things we do. And this, we hope, contribute also to adaptation to the climate change, because when it's warmer, it's drier, it's very hard to grow the plants. And you don't want, in the past, the solution was to take more land, but we are finishing the arable land. There is no more arable land available. You have to cut forests for that. So you need this diversity to be able to make the new revolution, the new green revolution.
It's really interesting, that comment. And I know, even so, for context, in southern Saskatchewan, where we grow the preponderance of our pulses, these protein-enhanced plants, you know, even 15 years ago, the varieties didn't allow. We didn't have enough growing heat degree days to grow a lot of the varieties. You know, the climate has actually allowed us to do more. So, but it's been a combination of more heating degree days as climates heated up a little bit. But on top of that, it's been the variety sort of development that's really pushed it. So, you know, Canada today, there's a group called AGT Food and Ingredients, is one of the largest exporters globally of lentils and chickpeas. And it's really primarily through the development of the species development and the advancement of the traits, as well as the climate change. But if you think about your research into, you know, again, solving or helping adapt to climate change, is that the type of development that you see as being key?
So you see lots of resilience. You see wheat, you see wild relatives of wheat, which grow, you know, in the wild without fertilizer, so you can have plants which are more efficient to get the fertilizer for the soil, or that can interact with bacteria which can fix the nitrogen. So today also studying the soil microbiome is something which is very important to be able to have more biological type of fertilizers. So this is definitely helping to find solution against climate change. Another approach is to say, I mean, you heard on the vertical farming, so to say, okay, the environment is not good, you have to wait for the tomatoes coming from California, and this means that you have to make tomatoes which have a long shelf life because they will travel, and believe me, when they have a long shelf life, they taste like carton. So it's better to have a short shelf life, not to transport, you reduce the carbon footprint of transportation, you can grow them in the backyard of the supermarket, in abandoned building. We saw in Montreal someone who is trying to use abandoned, there are 40 huge abandoned silos, and he's trying to develop vertical farming for this. So there are lots of ideas, lots of opportunities. You heard about the LED revolution. So again, there is a new environment. Now, you can do lots of engineering and robotics to adapt to grow plants in this environment, but you can also modify the plants. And today, the vertical farming is good mostly for the greeny leaf.
the basil that you see on the table, or lettuce, or it's very limited. And what we are doing, we are trying to develop, to redesign plants, like tomatoes, for example, which can grow in this vertical farming environment. So to be able to use the concept of vertical farming and to broaden it to new crops. And so, for example, we cloned a gene, we isolated the gene, which makes the plant bonsai, like a bonsai. So you can take any variety, make a small plant, which would be like the size of the lettuce, and grow them, in many, many floors, so that you can take advantage of all the space to grow lots of produce. When you do that, you save space, you save water, you save fertilizer, which otherwise would go to the aquifer or to the atmosphere. And we discussed before that nitrogen pollution is also an issue, both in the air and in the soil. Mm-hmm. So this is something that you can also reduce with the vertical farming. And another thing we're trying to do is it's our new big challenge, is to have plants which can grow with less light and be more efficient at turning light into biomass and fruit. And we believe this is feasible because we have a very controlled environment. So in nature, the plants, when they're under stress, they stop growing. They just close their mouths. They don't do carbon fixation. Okay? There is less evaporation. They stop to grow because maybe there is no water, so they close everything. In the controlled environment, you don't have to close anything. You can grow all the time. Mm-hmm. You can have almost 24 hours of light to grow, while in nature, or even in farming, you need the daylight balance. And finally, we're also in an era where you can really not only know the genome of all these tomatoes, but you know the proteins, and you know also what's called the metabolomics. You know all the small molecules that they produce. Now, plants are incredible in chemistry. They're fantastic chemists. We can make maybe 4,000 different molecules. Plants can do hundreds of thousands. Okay, so you can have pigments, you can have antioxidants, you can have all kind of volatiles for the taste. I mean, they do all these things. Part of it is for resistance to insect, part of it is good for our health. So we can really today redesign plant in a much more intelligent way that was done in the past to see what we do. And people may think that, well, maybe it's not the natural tomato, but I have news for you guys. The natural tomato is in nature, in the Andes, is toxic. So you better not eat the tomatoes in the Andes, from the Andes. So
it's a fascinating concept, though, because if I think about it, and I think to the traditional agriculture, we have spit all these companies, the big input companies of the world, Corteva's of the world, Nutrients and others, a lot of the seed development programs over the last 40 or 50 years have really been focused on trying to breed for hardiness or resistance or all these attributes that might not actually be that focused on health or nutrition, right? Yeah. So you want something to be able to withstand drought, as an example. Well, you might end up with a plant that's just not that good to eat or not that healthy to eat relative to optimizing the breeding program for health and nutrition. Mm-hmm. So you can take it inside and you can provide the perfect growing environment, and now all of a sudden you can focus your whole breeding line. But I guess the question for you then is... I think the
vertical farming releases you from many stresses that you have to deal with, also disease. If you work in a clean environment, today there are ways to clean the water, like in the swimming pool with ozone or with UV. There are ways to clean the air with also all kind of things. So you can work in a semi-sterile environment, and you don't have disease, you don't have insects, you don't need to spray insecticides, you don't need fungicides, you don't need herbicides, So it's a much more, so you have a new environment. That's the beauty of it. So it's a new challenge, really, to recreate plants which grow. It's a new revolution. It's a new green revolution that we try to participate to by adapting new crop to this new environment. So
yeah, it really is fascinating. And you are starting to see, I'll call it generation one of indoor growing, has really been focused on these, lettuce, microgreens, these high velocity crops that grow in 14 to 21 days roughly, because you need the velocity to justify the investment. But you're starting to see some higher value crops come in now. So berries has become a more prominent crop, strawberries in particular. There's a pollination issue there, but they've been able to sort of overcome that now. So berries have become, and even things like mushrooms now. A lot of different mushrooms that you wouldn't typically get are being grown much more locally and in a crazy amount of variety, actually. So it's a super fascinating evolutional.
Right.
Question for you though is how long does it take to develop a new bonsai tomato? Is that a 3-year evolution, 5 years? I'm just trying to get some context for.
Yeah. You know, in the past you wanted the mutation, so we had to irradiate the seeds or to treat them with some chemicals which are mutagenic, grow tens of thousands of plants, and select for one mutant, and then this mutant will have lots of other mutations because you irradiated thousands. So we'll have to cross it back to the original variety. And you want also, if you look for a trait which, you have to mutate both genes, dad and mom. Otherwise, you don't have the mutation because most mutations are recessive. So it would take years, many years, 5, 10 years.
Right.
Today, with technology like genome editing, you can do it in 1 year. You can shrink. Now, if you want to adapt it to many traits, so 3 years, 4 years, that's also a huge advance. Now, the tomatoes that we do, you can grow them in 7 weeks. So you also can do many generations. So
right.
It also shrinks in a number of years.
So the velocity of the whole process has been
is much
up.
faster.
Yeah, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
Is there, if you think about, in your role, like the one thing that's really intrigued me about the professor and his academic pursuits are very obvious in his accomplishments, but he's also been very successful at taking academic research and truly commercializing it. And I'm just curious about that because it doesn't strike me that's that common. A lot of academic research stays in academy and industry. So maybe could you just describe to me a little bit about how you've been able to sort of make that bridge from just pure academics and research into the commercialized effect?
Sure. So maybe I'll say a few words on, it's what I do, but I'm part of the Weizmann ecology.
As part of the Weizmann umbrella, yeah,
so
for sure.
I think like I say, some of my interest was really to understand the mechanisms which are working in evolution. And that's something which is a little bit, you would say, useless, and the beauty of, there is a book which came out many, many years ago. I think it's written by Abraham Foxman on the usefulness of useless knowledge. So one of the incredible things that we have in Weizmann is that we have a total freedom, academic freedom. So we're not pursuing any specific goal. The institute is a small place. It's only 4,000 people, 280 group of leaders, scientists, 1,500 students, and there are lots of interaction. There is even housing on campus, so scientists live together, work nearby. It's small, so there is lots of interaction going on, and you can really pursue your whatever crazy idea you have. So this is one aspect, and the other is that the institute try to hire good people, but we try to hire the best students, and the secret of the institute is very well known. Look for the best people, give them to do what they want, and create the environment where they can bloom, and that's it. And the mission when you're promoted, in the Weizmann Institute is look at the basic science. Nobody cares if you had patent or no patent. So we look only at the basic science. And the paradox here is that despite this policy, we have more patent per capita than any other institute in the world. And in the recent 8 years, there were about 100 companies we started from Weizmann, and 150 which were made by alumni, not directly Weizmann, but by alumni. So there is a huge ecological system also to do this transfer of discoveries into applied ideas. We are part of this ecology. My lab started 2 companies, and basically it's my student who wanted to go there. They say, well, we'd like to continue this, we'd like to do that, and some was based on patent that they worked on, and I'm standing behind them and helping them. And I think in Israel now we succeeded, people talk about the startup nation, to create an ecology where we have good knowledge in management, in raising funds, and we have people also who like to take risks.
Right. That is an important
Because
element.
I was asking my students, are you sure? I mean, you can have, like me, a nice career with tenure and everything you want and the freedom. And say, no, I want to try. So, okay, so you have risk takers. One of my students told me, I was under fire and I almost died several times. So what will happen to me? I will bankrupt. So they don't mind. They're very high risk takers. So we have all this continuum from the basic discoveries to the applications. And we have an office for technology transfer which take technology, licenses it, so it can license it to companies, or it can take it to startups and creating new companies. There are two main models.
Is there a strong relationship with what I'll call traditional industry? Because it strikes me that the one thing Canada's trying to do right now, if you're not familiar, is there's a few different initiatives, but one would be called Protein Industries Canada, or PIC, and it's really trying to leverage Canada's sort of strategic advantage in pulse and protein development into the next sort of, I'll call it process layer, value-added layer, and they've made a number of investments across the thing. But do you find you work with government and with traditional industry a lot in your approach, or is that becoming more prevalent, less prevalent? There's been a lot of consolidation at the industry level.
It's very much not driven by government. So we have as little government involved.
It's probably a good thing.
And it's lots to do with, if you want to license it, so this office will try, and the scientists will be proactive to look company which may be interested by a new drug, for example, or something like that. If you want to do a startup, so we have venture capitals which come and say what kind of innovations your guys are doing, and they try to look into that, and then from there it goes. It's not part of a general policy, but it happens, apropos you mentioned alternative protein, so we have a little bit of that going on in, actually it's interesting, part of it goes on in Canada, of making peas, which are high protein they have better taste than soya for the alternative protein. But there is a lot on what's called cultured meat. So it's meat which is taking cells, animal cells, from a cow or from whatever, and growing them in the lab. And what it came from, I mean, it's really a beautiful story. I mean, Israel is a superpower in this field of cultured meat, which is strange. But people working on stem cells, for example, they're interested to see how cells can proliferate and so on. So one of our scientists was working on the heart, and he was studying regeneration of the heart. So in young embryos or young individual, if there is damage to the heart, it can regenerate. With age, we lose this capacity. And he asked what is going on, and he found some factors which are causing the heart to regenerate. And for this, he made a company, and it was really basic research and development. He was interested to understand how the heart evolves and develops and so on. And from there was another scientist working on cell fusion. So cells, when a sperm and an egg meet, the membrane fuse and they get together. There are few cases of cell fusion. One of them is in muscles. So muscles are many cells which fuse to make these long fibers, long cells, which they have several polynucleate. I mean, there are long cells with many nuclei. They fuse together. There is fusion between the virus and the cell, as everybody learned recently with the COVID.
Of course, yeah.
So this guy was working on fusion of cells, and the other on stem cells and regeneration. And a discussion between them led to make the experiment in the test tube, putting the factors for regeneration together with the factor for fusion, and they got these crazy fibers of cells growing, and they started a company for alternative meat.
Right.
Based on that. So people, I mean, that's just an example how you take this basic research and you turn it into some invention. So yeah, protein is also a very interesting field in Israel to look into.
That's fascinating.
People who are interested.
Lab-grown steak. I don't know if we're there just yet, but
no.
at some point.
This is a bit like the vertical farming. It's
yeah, I know, that's right. I wanted to make sure I'm respecting the idea of having questions from the floor, so I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Levy. This is fascinating and very, very exciting what you're doing. My question actually comes back to how these products become available. And we've talked about global warming and the impact of biotech on growing in third world countries that can't afford to perhaps even get some grains in order for seeds and that products and that sort of thing. But one of the things that we noticed in Canada and in North America is that biotechnology companies have really taken on large farming in a very organized way, to the point that you have to license your grain products to the biotechnology company even just to grow it on your farm. And there's concerns about having cross-pollination from non-wild type products that could affect the growing. So when it gets back to your technology that's in Weizmann, the work that you're doing in an academic environment where this technology is potentially available to many people, how are you creating opportunities for farmers in third world countries or farmers that would not necessarily be able to afford the grains that perhaps North American farmers may be able to obtain? How are you making that possible?
I mean, that's a very difficult question. Sorry. See, I've lost my mic. I mean, you're right. First, science is published, so knowledge is public. Anyone can use it. Israel has connections with many countries, including in Africa. Lots of it is through the use of water. Now, regarding grains, we even have NGOs of people who came from Israel, who started to bring new varieties to Africa because they grow the grain and they save the seeds traditionally. And it turns out that seed companies have huge amount of grains which, when they expire, which means instead of germinating at 99%, they germinate at 90%, they throw them away. So this company, this NGO, is taking the seeds and bringing them to Africa, in Ethiopia in particular, and it increases the yield that they get by a lot. So, to work with a developing country is very difficult because you need really an infrastructure. It's not enough to give seeds and to give food. I mean, it's better to teach them to grow it and to help them to grow it. And this requires infrastructures and things and a non-corrupted political system and things which are beyond our understanding as scientists. But I should say that wheat is an example of a crop which is not, it's not an hybrid, it's not protected. Anyone can take the seeds and grow them. So seed saving is open. Anyone who wants to do it can do it. So the example you gave is mostly for corn and soybean from Monsanto and things like that. Yeah. And where they have some transgenic compounds which can indeed contaminate neighbor field, and this creates a huge problem of legal problems and so on. And Monsanto disappeared. It was bought by Bayer, and now there is a cultural change also there. So we'll see. Monsanto had a very aggressive policy, which, they had their intellectual property, they defended it. It's also legitimate. I mean, it's very hard to, cannot, but on parallel to that, there are some of the basic crop like wheat are really staple food. And they were not covered by genetic engineering, and they're not hybrids, so anyone could save seeds and continue to. That's why in wheat, for example, lots of the activities in the academia, while in maize, it's mostly in private companies because they make hybrids and they make more money. So it's a complex market, but how to reach the developing country, that's a very difficult question. I mean, the science we do is open to everyone. We have students also from some time which come from Africa. There is training of people also who come from Africa. Maybe people also from Asia, but they are quite advanced now there. So it's mostly about Africa, and there are programs of education which are also very important. People, some of them return home and bring the knowledge. So yeah, there is no simple.
There's a question in the back, and then I'll come back to you. A question in the back.
I mentioned earlier that I'm allergic to wheat, and I became allergic to wheat. Oh, thank you. I became allergic to wheat over time, and I'm just wondering if there's any research done around the changes to the plants and our bodies and our microbiomes and how we digest the food.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. Our microbiome is really part of the digestion in our body, which makes the digestion. In the Weizmann Institute, we have two scientists, Eran Elinav and Eran Segal, who were world experts in the field of the gut microbiome. And they try to predict, based on using artificial intelligence, who will be allergic to what, based on the profile of the bacteria in their guts. And the bacteria in our gut, they interact with our immune system, because the immune system must distinguish between the good bacteria and the bad bacteria. So we have a very complex interaction between the gut microbiome, what we eat, and the bacteria themselves, and the immune system. So this is very complicated. I don't know about your case in particular, but I know that in wheat, it is possible to knock out many genes today with methods of genome editing. If we take gluten, so one of the problems is that if you knock out all the genes, you lose all the elasticity. Gluten is providing the elasticity of the bread. But to go one step further, I'm not sure the gluten is the main problem. And I heard some theories, but I didn't see hard data on that people have been claiming a lot against herbicides and all kinds of things. Now, if you take the glyphosate, like in the Roundup Ready, you can drink it, nothing happens to you. It's a very safe herbicide. But why? Because it doesn't target our protein, it targets genes from bacteria. The only problem now people are starting to think, maybe exposure for 20, 30 years to certain type of herbicide can affect our microbiome. Not our body, not our cells, our bacteria. And this is a new way of thinking, it is a new direction of research. It's very fascinating. So it's going to be interesting and complex, stay tuned. But we really have world leaders in this field. I even was myself part of an experiment. We tried different type of bread, whole bread and white bread. And the results were incredible. Every person reacted differently. So this is
purely anecdotal, but I hear a lot of people from here that travel to Europe that can't eat bread here, can eat it there, just because of the different wheat types. But for what it's worth. Anyways, apologies. You had a question here on the floor.
If you can elaborate a bit about the potential of capturing CO2 and other greenhouse gases using plants, and what the maturity level of this new plant product, because intuitively it sounds like a much more feasible solution than industrial CO2 capturing devices.
So plant feed on CO2, so they do the major capture of CO2. Here is a story. The numbers, more or less, for all the CO2 that is emitted, half is taken by plants and algae, and the other half stays in the atmosphere. So the plants naturally don't have the capacity to absorb all the CO2 that is produced. Now, if you want to offset carbon emission, someone made a calculation that for each person we need about 100 trees planted. It's difficult. You make the number, we are 8 billion, so 800 billion trees That's a lot to plant. In the vertical farming, I didn't mention, you see, I'm a bit obsessed by that. We enrich with CO2. We enrich, and they capture lots of CO2. And when we enrich with CO2, we manage to grow them with less light. It's one of the tricks. So, because it's easier for them to feed themselves. So plants alone won't make it. I mean, we should have more trees. We should plant more trees, and they will help. But it's not the only solution. We have to reduce emissions, and to find also a new way to capture. If it's by bacteria, one of our scientists, he was with me in the beginning of the tour, and he abandoned me, Ron Milo. He's teaching E. coli, which is a gut bacteria, to feed itself instead of the sugar in our body on CO2 from the air. And for that, he redesigned what's a field which is called synthetic biology. He redesigned the metabolic pathway with enzymes, which enable the bacteria to take the CO2. So that's one direction. Another direction is chemistry. You could capture from the air or directly from the power plants where the CO2 is emitted. You could capture the CO2 using chemistry. Chemists are not yet, they can do it already, but not yet in a way that is scalable. But this is a very important field that is emerging now. And everyone has his bets, so it might be possible that chemistry will help to capture the CO2.
I would only just add, we're seeing, like in the broader ag tech ecosystem, we're seeing a whole host of new products in the biological sort of sphere that are focused on enriching carbon capture and carbon content in the soil, because the soil biome has been neglected for
arguably the entire process of agriculture development, but that's becoming a big focal point.
If I may add to that,
yeah, of course.
The soil is a very nice sink of carbon. Why? Because the roots dump about 30% of what they produce of the sugar and carbohydrates and all kind of compounds in the soil. You say, what? It's a waste. Why dump your energy there? They feed the bacteria which grows in the sphere, which are beneficial, which can help the plant in other ways. So this is why the soil becomes a sink for carbon, because it comes from the plant. And also when you harvest the plant, you can leave it in the organic material in the soil. So this is also one way to contribute to capturing of CO2. And I see another question.
We have time for one more question, so can you wait for the mic here? And I would just note while she's waiting for the mic, we're seeing new fertilizer products are using discarded hulls and fiber products out of like that protein fractionation that I mentioned earlier. And so they'll take some of the leftover fiber and they'll create fertilizers now that get used on the soil to re-inject it effectively into the soil. It's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. The discussion is really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot. I'd like to switch the emphasis of the discussion though towards inputs into the system and what's happening in the value chain. So part of the issue that we're dealing today is we have far too much food being produced in the wrong places, and it's actually not reaching the right people in the right condition. So one of the largest contributors to actually climate change is agriculture itself. We have vast amounts of food that are wasted. So are you doing any research, and this is from a technological standpoint, in terms of reducing the amount of food that we have in the system such that we can actually save the agricultural land to produce more high value crops, but also to direct that produce to the population and the communities that need the nutritious food that they are currently lacking?
Yeah, I can go first if you like.
You start and I can continue.
So the short answer is you're absolutely right. And what I would say, there's an entire investment vertical or silo that's focused just on that. And so it comes at the equation from a few different ways. So the waste side is one. So it's just one example here in the local valley, for example. They've used, there's a group called Entera Feed that's backed by ADM. And the concept there is they're taking food waste or leftover waste or products that don't look good, even as an example, which aren't suitable for the supermarket, which is kind of silly, but it's perfectly valuable food. And they're using that to grow, get ready for this, soldier fly larvae, because it's a natural source of sugars for them. And then what they're doing is they're effectively growing the larvae, they cook them and they grind them up into an animal feed. And so it's one small example of using a waste stream of food to produce another high value product, to recycle it. The other way to come at it is earlier on is sort of like is preservation. So there's a few groups, Appeal and a few others, that are focused on providing greater shelf life as an example. And I think ultimately the vertical farming one is probably a good example where it's just trying to grow more product closer to source on demand. And so those are maybe three different avenues that are sort of capital is trying to create new solutions. But it is ultimately a big problem because the big bread baskets of the world tend to produce so much, and then we process it and we push it out. It doesn't always get appropriately allocated.
Well, I think you gave the main answers. I mean, about 30% of the food is wasted. We met in Canada the McCain potato industry, and actually one of our scientists is working, on the phenomena of greening. When the potatoes see the light, they turn green, and it's poison. So he found the gene, the alkaloids, which are involved in the greening, and now he's knocking them out. So 30% of potatoes are wasted in storage because of the greening. So hopefully this can contribute to this problem. So that's one way to improve the ability of plants to sustain the shelf life of the plants. But as I said before, shelf life is not always such a great idea. And yeah, that's a huge issue. So people, should also the way they, part of it is wasted in the farmer's field, part of it is in the supermarket, and part of it in our fridge. So everyone has every problem has to be taken care separately. Vertical farming is one of the solutions because there is no long-term storage. You produce in a continuous manner all the time. There is no problem with storage, and so that's also.
With that, we want to promise to get you all back to your day jobs. So I'll say first and foremost for me, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Weizmann Institute for hosting. It's been a lot of fun. I will stick around afterwards if anyone wants to have a discussion. I could talk about ag and ag tech for hours. But I think with that, I'll turn it back to our gracious hosts.
Thank you, Steve and Avi, for that fascinating discussion. There was a lot of information given today, and I'm sure we could have continued talking all afternoon. I have no doubt that each of us will leave with at least one takeaway from today. My takeaway is that not just the importance of science in moving us forward, but the importance of science and industry collaborating to move us forward for the next 10 years to really count. At Weizmann Canada, we invest in discovery, recognizing that with time, exploration, and resources, the scientists at Weizmann put hope in action and make a global impact. We're driven by the purpose of science to develop new knowledge and to improve the world. I invite you to learn more about the Institute on Environmental Sustainability. By when you leave, there are, Anna's holding it up, it's seed paper. And so first, please scan the QR code to learn more about the Institute. Then you can watch the incredible 3-minute video that unfortunately Wi-Fi did not allow us to complete today, but it's really informative and outstanding. And then you could plant the paper and watch it grow. So enjoy that. I'd like to recognize our valued leadership here today, as well as my Weizmann Canada colleagues, Beth Freeman and Anna Katsaforis. We're here too, so along with Avi and Steve, Anna, myself, and Beth, if anybody has any questions or would like to talk about anything else. And finally, thank you to the team here at Terminal City Club for their warm hospitality. This venue was chosen intentionally because of its efforts in environmental sustainability, including insourcing both food and beverage. Thank you again for spending the afternoon with us.